So the question that was asked is, was Jesus Christ a yogi? So the simple answer is yes. Jesus was teaching a form of yoga called Bhakti Yoga. This is a form of spiritual practice which is based on devotion, worship, surrender and love. It is probably the most common form of yoga in the world today and has been for a very long time. Usually, the person being worshipped in Bhakti Yoga sects is elevated to the point where they're considered to be divine. Quite often they're considered to be supremely divine, so there's no one higher than them, even in the heavens. And we see this happening with Christianity, and we also see it with sects such as the Krishna worshipping sects, where Krishna is considered to be the supreme form of God. And in the case of Jesus, he presented himself in this way by saying, I and the Father are one, where the Father, or Abba, is God, and there's no one higher than him. And Jesus very much encouraged people to believe in him, to follow him, and to have faith in him, even while stating that he was one with the Supreme God. So he was setting himself up to be the object of worship in a Bhakti Yoga sect. And if we look at the way in which Bhakti Yoga sects work, such as the Krishna worshipping sects, people sing in praise of the object of their worship, which is Krishna in the case of a Krishna worshipping sect, and they bow down in front of statues of the object of worship. And the spiritual practices that Jesus did, and which he taught, were all yogic practices. He taught prayer, fasting and charity, which are all practices from the yogic tradition, samyama, upavasa and dana. As well as this, the teachings of Jesus were fundamentally rooted in Vedanta. Vedanta are the early spiritual teachings of India and are summarized in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Vedanta is monistic, in that the divine is seen to ultimately be one and is all and everything. The culmination of the spiritual path in Vedanta is the recognition that the individual self and the divine are one and the same thing. In the language of Sanskrit, this is Ayam Atman Brahman. This individual self is the Supreme Being. And in modern day English, it would be the Father and I are one. Where this starts to get really interesting is with what happens when we start to look at some of the things that Jesus said about himself, as recorded in the New Testament of the Bible, and some of the things that Krishna said about himself, as recorded in the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita was composed at least 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. There are a number of what are called I am sayings that Jesus is famous for, where he talked about who he really is. One of the most famous of those quotes is where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the life. If we look at the Bhagavad Gita, we find Krishna saying, I am the life force in all beings. That's from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, verse 9. Another of the famous I am statements of Jesus was, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. That is found in the Gospel of John. And in the Gita, we find Krishna saying, those who know me as unborn and beginningless, and as the Supreme Lord of the universe, they amongst mortals are free from illusion and released from all sins. That's from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10. Another of these I am statements of Jesus was, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Now, Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, and the Gospels of the New Testament were originally written in Greek. In the Gita, we find Krishna saying, amongst all the letters, I am the first letter A. Again, that's from chapter 10 of the Gita. Obviously, this is translated into English from Sanskrit, but A is actually the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, just as it is of the English alphabet, and as alpha is in the Greek alphabet. So both Jesus and Krishna said that they are the first letter of the alphabet. Jesus also said, "I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end." We find that in Revelations chapter 22. And Krishna said, "I am seated in the heart of all living entities. I am the beginning, middle, and end of all beings." And again in the same chapter of the Gita, we find Krishna saying, "I am the origin of all creation. Everything proceeds from me. The wise who know this perfectly worship me with great faith and devotion." That is from the Gita, chapter 10, verse 8. Another very famous quote from Jesus, which I've already mentioned, was, "The Father and I are one." That's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 10. And if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, we find Krishna saying, "Neither celestial gods nor the great sages know of my origin. I am the source from which the gods and great seers come." And after the death of both Jesus and Krishna, we find descriptions of how they rose up to heaven. In the Christian Bible, we find in Acts 1, referring to Jesus Christ after he died, "Now, when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly towards heaven, as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, 'Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven.'" That's from Acts 1, verse 9 to 11. And after Krishna died, we find this description of his ascension to heaven in the Bhagavata Purana. "His body, most attractive to all the worlds, he entered his heavenly abode. Just as mortals cannot determine the path lightning describes in the sky while leaving the clouds, the Devas, the higher beings, could not determine Krishna's path into the heavens." That's found in the Bhagavata Purana, chapter 11, verses 6 and 9. And so, what about returning to earth to save mankind? Obviously, Jesus made several references that he would come again at the end of days, and that people should make themselves ready. And not surprisingly, we find Krishna saying very similar things. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, "Whenever and wherever there is a decline in spiritual practice, at that time I create myself. In each age I am born to protect goodness, to destroy evil, and to preserve righteousness, Dharma." That's in chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. So we can see that Jesus was very much basing his teachings of yoga on the things that Krishna had said, and on the Bhakti Yoga tradition in general. He was not taking the things that Krishna had said word for word, but he was using the teaching style and making the same statements that Krishna had made. It was quite possible that Jesus would have come into contact with the teachings of Krishna and of the Bhagavad Gita, as there were caravan trade routes running from China below the Himalayas, passing through the Middle East on their way to Europe. And people on the caravans would tell stories around the campfires at night. Now you might be wondering at this stage, why would both Jesus Christ and Krishna have said that they were the first letter of the alphabet? It seems quite extraordinary. But they were both trying to point to something. It's like an incredible secret hidden in plain sight. They were trying to point to something called purity, or sattva in the Sanskrit language. Purity is there in everything, and is there in ourselves. And if we can learn to see it, and to come to see it in ourselves, then we can come to know reality, and to know the truth of our own nature. Another word for purity is love, and another word for purity is truth. There's also the true Dharma, which means the way. So we find Jesus saying, I am the way, I am the truth, love your neighbour as yourself, and so on. Jesus also said, I am the door. These are all keys or clues to how to see the sacred in the mundane. And recognizing the sacred in the mundane is the process of liberation or enlightenment. Krishna laid it out more extensively than Jesus did, at least according to the records that we have. Krishna said these things: out of all the words, I am the sacred syllable Om. Amongst all processes of surrender, I am that process of surrender that involves the repetition of sacred sounds. That's chapter 10, verse 25 of the Gita. And again, out of all the things that purify, I am the breeze. Out of all the branches of knowledge, I am the knowledge of the self. That's from verses 31 and 32. Self-knowledge is another term for liberation in the yogic tradition. So we find in the words of Jesus and the words of Krishna an extraordinary description of the process of seeing the purest aspect of existence, its sattvic nature, and through that seeing divinity and coming to identify wholly with that. That's why you keep seeing them saying, I am this, I am this, rather than look towards. Pure perception, or sattva, is actually a stage on the path of liberation, and divine realization involves the transcendence even of that stage. Personally, I regard Jesus as being a very high-level yogi, one of the highest that there has been in the last few thousand years. Certainly he can be considered to be at the same level as Krishna. He was a very beautiful teacher and a very pure practitioner on the spiritual path. He was a Bhakta and an Advaitin, which means a non-dual teacher. He also taught Karma Yoga, the yoga of action, and he taught people to love each other and to turn the other cheek, and to not engage in violence. And he taught people to surrender, and to fast, and to pray, and to prepare themselves for what is to come, which is grace and salvation.